Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddell. I'm the director. This event shows that we are agile and adaptable at the IFG since it only began to be arranged at 11:30 yesterday, once the Civil Service Reform Plan had gone through Cabinet, and we immediately, and I'm delighted to see such a distinguished, varied audience, those involved in the design of the Civil Service Reform Plan 1 year on, and those of us and others affected by it. What we're going to do is have Francis Maude, as Minister for the Cabinet Office, speaking first, followed by Bob Kerslake, as Head of the Civil Service, speaking second. I will ask some questions. We'll open it up to questions. We've only got an hour. It's a very tight timetable on this, but I'm very grateful for both Francis and Bob coming here for the only public event in the launch of this, so that we can have it immediately on the record. You see that the various hashtags are up there for those of you who want to tweet. We're keen for this to be start of a public debate. Very glad to see Bernard Jenkin here as Chairman of PASC. And they'll be engaged in this as part of their inquiry into civil service reform. It's the opposite of the Fourth Bridge with PASC. It's not a question of them repainting the bridge. They've got to decide when they can finish the bridge in their report. And everything produced by Francis is kind of there's something else to comment on. So I'm very glad to see the people here for the start of the debate. We have produced an immediate response ourselves, and I'll come on to that later. And we've had a blog from Peter Thomas, who heads our civil service reform strand of our work here, and we'll be doing a more detailed, considered report probably at the end of the week when we've gone through in full the detail. Over to you, Francis.
Peter, thank you very much. Is it all right if I stay sitting?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm only going to say a few words, and Bob as well, and then we're obviously happy to respond to questions and take part in discussion. Well, I mean, we've published, Bob and I published the first plan a bit over a year ago, and we think, I mean, there was some criticism when we published it that it wasn't a kind of high-flown, total strategic vision. It was a set of rather kind of granular, practical actions, which I think we'd all concluded, and many civil servants had concluded, were needed to make things work better. What we said was we would report. We'd mark our homework, and a year on we'd report on progress. At 1 year on, we have produced what I think is a very honest and open report. We've resisted the temptation to sort of put a rosy gloss over it all. We've said where we think there's been good progress. We've said where we think we underestimated how difficult things were, either because they're just big, difficult things that take a long time to change, or because we overestimated the what the starting point was. And we've been very clear about things where I think we expected between us to have made more progress by now, and should have done, and we've been clear about what the reasons we think are for not having made as much progress on those. And we said a year ago that this wasn't the last word. There never will be a last word on civil service reform. There's constantly going to be change. The world is changing very fast. There are different needs, different expectations. We face a period of austerity that isn't about to come to an end next year or the year after, as the spending round has just demonstrated. So a constant need for the civil service to adapt and do things differently and better. And expectations of the public rising, which is why we concluded that there were some further steps needed, and we've set them out. All of them are incremental and evolutionary. None of them require legislation. None of them do any violence at all to the fundamentals of the Northcott-Trevelyan approach, which is about a permanent, politically impartial civil service. Northcott and Trevelyan can lie easy in their graves, but we can do things differently, and the three areas we have particularly picked up are the need to run the cross-government functions, the cross-government services in a more corporate way, because we have an inheritance of departments which have expected to have all of their sort of freestanding services. That's not a model that's sustainable in today's world. So quite apart from traditional back offices where we had already embarked on intensifying shared services, we're looking at areas such as HR, legal, where we are. Sir Paul Jenkins, the Treasury Solicitor, is already well down the path of recreating a single government legal service. Procurement and commercial, IT and digital, finance, where there has been for a little time now a part-time head of the finance profession, the Treasury, looking at how that can be strengthened, as I think the non-executive board members who've come in from the private sector have universally said that the financial management function in government needs to be stronger. So that part is the first. The second is about support for ministers, where the IPPR report, indeed I think the IFG's own report, Peter, suggests that in any comparison with countries with similar systems, Westminster-based systems such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, ministers, the direct support available to ministers is much less than our counterparts. And so we've suggested and proposed the ability for ministers in charge of departments to appoint an extended ministerial office, appointed personally and accountable to them, which you would expect to comprise career civil servants doing at least the traditional private office function, which remains essential, but including obviously special advisors on the same basis as now, and potentially people also who are civil servants and who are appointed maybe from outside on fixed-term appointments. And some departments have gone down that path already. It's already something which is permitted under the Civil Service Commission guidance, and so the difference will be that these are all appointed personally and by the minister, but subject to the Civil Service Commission's recruitment guidelines. And the third element is about permanent secretary tenure, which is Tony Blair announced in 2004 that all senior civil servants actually should be appointed in future on a fixed term tenure of 4 years. It didn't really happen in a way that was material, that made a difference, and we are saying that it should be applied now in relation to permanent secretaries and on a 5-year tenure with no presumption of renewal, but it's possible at the discretion of the Prime Minister for the tenure to be renewed. And that's very much brings Britain into line with pretty much universal practice elsewhere in similar systems. Other systems tend to have a tougher regime in that it tends to be a fixed-term contract, so if the contract isn't renewed, then people leave the civil service. That's not what we're proposing here, but nonetheless, no presumption of people extending in their current post, and so we think that's a good approach, and it is very much a joint approach that we're taking, and we think these are again modest but important steps which will make the system work better. I mean, we're in a very competitive world, and we need everything to work the best it can, and a civil service firing on all cylinders is essential to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Very much. Bob.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I'll make a few comments. I'll keep them short again to allow time for questions. First thing to say is that 1 year on, the case for reform seems, if anything, stronger than it was a year ago. I in no sense feel that the agenda is either finished or reduced in priority. The 1 year on report is very much focused around what we've achieved and done well, and being clear about that, and what we've made less progress than we wanted to do, and being very honest about that. And I think that's the right way to do a progress report. Recognise what's achieved, be honest about what hasn't been achieved. Just for the avoidance of doubt, because there's been a bit of coverage, this is a joint report, and it's a set of shared conclusions and shared I'm very, very clear that implementing these additional further actions will strengthen the ability of ministers to identify and oversee the delivery of their priorities, and it will strengthen the capacity of the civil service to deliver on behalf of ministers and government. So I wanted to get that point really very clear. It's worth saying that this report is about the government-wide reform programme. It's not about all of the reform that is going on. And alongside the government-wide reform programme, each department is going through huge change at the moment, whether it's in HMRC to digitise the way they deliver their services, or it's the rehabilitation programme in MOJ, or indeed it's departments like CLG where we've seen reductions in size of something like 40%. This is an era of very big change, and what you see in the plan sits alongside and indeed supports and complements the change going on in departments. I think in terms of one of the things that frustrates me, it is this sense in which it's reported that civil servants are resistant to change in the civil service. That's not my experience, having spent a lot of time out and about talking to civil servants. They both acknowledge and recognise the need for change and support the fact that we're taking that forward. So it's quite important that both at the senior level and in civil service as a whole, we don't get into a position that says this is a programme that is being done to us by ministers. It's an agenda that we share and has mutual benefits to it. I wanted to highlight some of the successes over the year and then highlight some of the priorities for the year ahead. In terms of successes for the year, I think introducing a consistent performance management programme across the whole of the civil service that identifies and recognises good performance, exceptional performance, and identifies and tackles underperformance, moving towards, if you like, a forced ranking system where we identify the top 25%, the middle 65%, and the bottom 10%. And again, to be very clear about this, the bottom 10% doesn't mean people immediately move out. It identifies those who need action to improve and to be worked on in those terms. So I think that is a real step forward that tackles one of the most consistent issues I've picked up from both ministers and indeed from civil servants themselves. Second thing is a considerable amount of strengthening of how we handle major projects. And this, to be very direct about it, has been an Achilles heel for the civil service. We must be honest about that. We now have a much higher level of assurance on those projects in terms of those we're confident about delivering, but we're not there yet. There's a lot more to be done. If you look at the further actions, it recommends approval of the Brown report and approval of changes around the so-called osmolality rules to allow SROs for projects to report direct into select committees. So I think it's a success story, but a lot more to do. I think a third area of real progress is around digital, where we now have 25 exemplar projects which, delivered, will, I think, change the face of government and change the way we think about how we deliver public services. I think it's as big as that. And the last thing I'll pick out is that we now have a clear understanding at different levels of the civil service about what we're looking for in terms of skills and abilities, the so-called competency framework. And that's now something applied across the whole of government, and it will make it much easier to identify talent and move people around across the civil service. The agenda which you all know I'm very committed to, which is a more unified civil service. In terms of priorities for the year ahead, let me just pick a few of those out. First of those is that we have done the capabilities plan, but it was late. We now need to press on with implementation. And I would particularly single out strengthening our commercial skills and procurement skills, and I would also pick out our project and programme management for the reasons I said earlier. So that is a priority for the year ahead. I think a second priority for the year ahead is the work around corporate leadership, strengthening corporate leadership. And I think that's valuable both in terms of efficiency, we think we can save money on that, and it's valuable in terms of raising standards, getting a more consistent standard. It's countercultural for the civil service, which has historically been federal, but I'm absolutely convinced it's the right way to go. The third area I picked up as a priority is management information. Bluntly, we have struggled on this. We have produced quarterly data, and it's still not of a decent quality. We will publish that quarterly data in the year ahead, which is the surest way to get the quality up. And we will strengthen management information in departments. Absolutely clear on that. And then the last one, but definitely not least, is improving the workplace for staff. One of the most consistent bits of feedback for us is how we can make the workplace work better for staff in delivery of their jobs. Often that comes up far more frequently than the issues around terms and conditions, for example. The most consistent issue there is IT, and let's say it's work in progress. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob. Could I take up something you mentioned? Sorry, we've got a slight mic problem. Could I take up something which comes out in the beginning of the report, your joint preface, where you say, well, why has it been a patchy record over the last 2 months since the reform plan was launched? And you mentioned leadership. And one of the issues on that, I mean, something you mentioned, Bob, which was a lot of work going on in departments, including your own, with very big changes there, and the linkage between what's happening in departments and what's happening at the centre. Because certainly from us at the IFG, it strikes that they're not always lined up, and that people will be doing their thing in departments and that don't feel necessarily fully committed or willing to put up the leadership for what the central drive. They see what's happening in their own department and willing to get on with that, but don't feel that kind of, both at a political level and a civil service level, that commitment to the overall picture and the central picture. And that, you know, to put it crudely, that the enthusiasts like you two, and a lot of people in this room, but that doesn't always communicate itself throughout Whitehall, either at the political or the civil service level.
Do you want me to come in first?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
2 or 3 points, really. One is, in what's been a federal model, that's not surprising. I mean, let's be honest about it. That's how, in federal models, people would interpret corporate change. But I do think we have got agreement on the key priorities at permanent secretary level and at ministerial level now through the cabinet. And I do pick up when I go around and talk to civil servants that they understand that some of the change can happen in their own department, but some can only happen if it's done civil service wide. So if you're going to tackle the issue of performance, you want a consistent performance system. If you're going to allow movement between departments, you need a consistent way of assessing capabilities, for example. So I think people do understand that some of this is departmental and some of it's civil service wide. And I think we're steadily getting more recognition of that and more championing of it. But the leadership bit we were referring to there was, I think at the beginning, we hadn't sufficiently clearly identified who was leading on some of the actions in the plan. And we lost time, is the honest answer. We now have clear leaders, and we've identified the resources needed for each of those actions. So I'm pretty confident we will see progress over the year ahead on those.
Francis?
Well, I agree with everything Bob said. I mean, I think, and I think you're right actually to identify that at the outset there wasn't quite the same kind of consistent view across government, either at ministerial or senior official level. But I think that has changed a lot actually over the last 12 months. And I think there's a much stronger sense now, and a much stronger desire to, if you're in a department and you're driving a big reform program, to see civil service reform not as a kind of distraction, but as a kind of part of the motor of making it work better. You know, when you look at the things we're talking about, better performance management, stronger capability, responsiveness, more digital, more unified, these are all things that can support change in departments, not kind of be a distraction. I think it possibly, inevitably, took a little time for that to be really clear, but I think it is much clearer now than it was.
Could I just another separate point, and I'll open it up after a further question. On the extended ministerial office, the word cabinet does not appear for a variety of reasons. But it's not entirely clear. I mean, the size of the extended office, you say that the number of SPADs involved, with the external recruitment, appointed by the minister but subject to civil service guidelines, would that be parallel to what happens in one or two departments? Now, I think where are the lines of authority? They're appointed by the minister, but where does it lie with the permanent secretary? I felt there were quite a lot of ambiguities there, and also there's the issue of junior ministers, which you kind of leave out of the picture. I mean, one of the things one of my colleagues here has identified, I mean, a unique feature of the British system is the number of junior ministers we have. But even governments of comparable size don't have many junior ministers, they do it in a different way. Yet they appear to be kind of floating under this model.
Well, I mean, we haven't been prescriptive in how it should work, and the reason they're not called cabinets is they aren't cabinets in any way that would be recognised. Cabinets tend to be in a system where ministers are physically removed from the officials who are advising them and implementing what they do. They tend to be entirely political or entirely kind of mono-status, if you like, as a one status. In Australia, for example, ministerial offices they're all politically unrestricted. They're employed under a different act of parliament. They all are, even if they're mainstream career civil servants, they're seconded. So it isn't a cabinet model. Really, actually, what we're looking at is how the number 10 Prime Minister's office, now Deputy Prime Minister's office, has worked for some time, which is kind of physically integrated and co-located, operating in a very sort of fungible way, but having that sense, which, because actually if you're the Prime Minister you don't have a department, so there is a very strong sense that your office is your office. Actually, if you're a minister in a department, there is a sense, and others have expressed this to me, that it's the department's office which is kind of on loan to you. And actually, if you really want to be able to drive things really effectively, there needs to be an unambiguous sense that it's your office. And it's your interface with the department. It's not there, absolutely not there to keep the department at bay. In fact, one of the things we're writing into this is a requirement that advice given by officials in the department must be presented to the minister. It is not for the minister's office to keep that at bay. They can comment on it and would do, and that happens clearly now. But advice given by officials must go in front of the minister. As far as junior ministers are concerned, well, it's kind of, not trying to turn everything upside down all at once. There is a specific issue which is relevant in a coalition, which is where you have junior ministers who are of a different party from the minister in charge of the department. That junior minister will have some sort of role which is scanning on behalf of the other party what's going on in across the department, which is actually a way of getting issues resolved more readily at departmental level rather than being elevated to a more senior level. And so we've included provision in those circumstances for there to be some sort of extended office, but subject to the agreement of the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister.
Just before bringing Bob in, what about the size of office and number of special advisors? I mean, we say it will depend on the Secretary of State, but presumably there are going to be some guidelines that obviously got to be within the departmental budget. I mean, you said that specifically in the plan. Yeah. But is it going to be a dozen new people, and how many spans would that be?
Well, in terms of special advisors, there's absolutely no change in that they're still subject to being appointed in the same way. It's always subject to the approval of the Prime Minister. We have said that a minister could, if they want to, designate, give them different titles. One of them could be a Chief of Staff, as is already the case with Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. And so we should, and indeed in number 10, they have a whole load of different titles. So that's not a fantastically big deal. There may be more special advisors. That's always been a movable feast, so an increase there is possible, but again subject to control by the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. In terms of the size of it's not clear what the size of ministerial offices is at the moment, because actually, as Jeremy Hayward was explaining this morning, some ministers have put together different units in different ways that are effectively the minister's office. So in one place it might be, in a couple of departments actually, there's a strategy unit headed by a civil servant which actually operates effectively as the minister, as part of the minister's office, which kind of extends its ambit. I have a very small policy advisory team in the Cabinet Office whose job it is to kind of scan through the plethora of write rounds that there are, you know, to read them, gut them, pick up the things that I'm likely to be interested and worry about and advise me on that. They're technically, I think, not part of my office, but they kind of feel like they probably should be. So if you were to kind of where you draw the line around it, you would end up with very different sizes. But we're not talking about huge increases. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, I think a journalist said, well, is it 12 people, is it 20 people? And my response was, that's probably about the range, and it'll be different in different places. I'd be surprised if it's much bigger than that.
Bob?
Yeah, just a few points. It's worth starting by saying that each of the components that would make up an extended ministerial office already exist. So we already have private offices. It's already clear that ministers need to be happy with the people in their private office, and on occasion when ministers change, those private offices also change. Secondly, we've had special advisors for some time now, again very much tailored to the needs of the individual minister, and we've actually had people as expert advisors on fixed-term contracts coming in to support ministers as well, again very much linked to the needs of the minister. So what this does is bring it together and identify it as a set of resources that particularly are there to support the minister, and we've identified it as an extended ministerial office. So to that extent, it doesn't either change the law or change the key elements that we've had in place for some time, it seems to me. And in terms of management, those rules about staff, civil servants having to report to civil servants still stand. Yeah. So we won't face a situation where civil servants will report into a special advisor, because that's ruled out by law. Second point to make is that this will be down to each individual minister to decide, which is why you can't say exactly how many it will be, but the proposals on extended ministerial offices will need to be approved by the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. Third point to make is we're very clear that this needs to be set up in a way that doesn't create a barrier between the department and the ministers. So advice will go to ministers from civil service in the same way as it does now. Permanent secretaries will be consulted on appointments in the same way as they are now.
Yeah. Just can I, before final question for me before opening up, I see people very keen to it, is something which is hinted at in the, particularly towards the end of the report, is looking at some of the much bigger long-term challenges. Something we are increasingly concerned about at the IFG is the continuation of fiscal restraint, squeeze, which will go way beyond 2015-16. The need, and you referred to it yourself in your remarks, Bob, of moving away from the federal model to a more unified model. You had shared services, but it could be much more fundamental than that. You know, the fact that Paul Jenkins has brought together the legal advice and so on, and that's happening in other areas. But it's actually much bigger questions on the shape and structure of Whitehall. And it's hinted at, but you've got to get that going. I mean, in 2 years' time, whoever's in government, we're in the middle of a very difficult spending review. If people don't think about it before the election, quite soon, about the future structures, functional relationships, what way you want departments to operate, you've got to face very serious problems in 2 years' time.
Well, I'm always reluctant to accept that there should be limits to our ambition for what we can achieve. But even I'm willing to say that actually the direction we've set for ourselves in terms of driving functional leadership and what are currently kind of the same services provided across government, making that operate in a much more integrated way. That's a big program, you know. In a really in a big private sector company, doing that typically takes 5 years to achieve that, and it certainly won't take any less than that for us. So yes, there are issues about, there will be questions people will raise about the kind of traditional departmental structure, and we could embark on a massive exercise on that, and it may well be something others want to do.
I was thinking what John Brown had raised in lecture about a month ago, that obviously he's struck, and so are some of the other NEDs, by the need to think pretty radically about the structure. I mean, for example, there's a wholly different model in Scotland. Yeah. Nothing to do with the constitutional position of Scotland. It was brought in 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, and indeed in Northern Ireland, where sometimes it's said that moving to the model that Bob and I are proposing on functional leadership, that somehow cuts across accounting officer responsibilities. In fact, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, it works absolutely fine with exactly the same kind of structure, accounting officer structure, but having really very integrated functions is not a problem. I mean, I think the things that some of those kind of practical humdrum things that we're doing will, if a future government wants to look more radically at the departmental structure, will make it easier. For example, having common standards promotion, which Bob has introduced and which we're pushing through, the competency framework, so you've got similar standards. Sorting out the massively annoying issues around IT systems, where they're all separate, there's very little interoperability, which makes it much more difficult for people to move around. Very different terms and conditions in terms of employment, different departments, which may mean when there have been machinery of government changes, you have people on very different terms sitting side by side in a new department. If we make a success of feeling and being in some of these kind of more mundane ways, much more unified, so that people become sort of, employment becomes much more sort of fungible, then the issues around looking at different kind of departmental structure become a lot easier to deal with. So I think there are things we can do without wanting to uproot the whole thing.
Bob?
Very quickly, so I'm really keen to get other people's questions. If we were simply thinking that this process of reductions in spending would end in 2015-16, you might say we could stagger on with the current model. But if you think we're going to be in a period beyond that of further drives for efficiency, it's absolutely clear that you have to think of new models. And that's really what we're saying here. We need to, and the work won't wait till 2015-16. It is and will start now.
Right. Opening up, Janet.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, there's a mic coming through, Janet.
Thank you. Janet Periskeever. I was for a while the first Civil Service Commissioner and a strong believer in the complete independence of the civil service. It's been really interesting to hear the holistic view and great relief to hear that we're talking about the whole reform of the civil service in the way that you've just described, and not just tinkering at the top with who appoints who, as if that's going to make, you know, the long-term big difference. But I'm particularly interested, I think, in the support for ministers issue, and wonder why you've not gone for a political team. It always seemed to me that the strength of the SPADs was that it freed up civil servants to remain objective and independent, because then the special advisors could put a political overlay on what the objective advice was in relation to the policy of the government of the day. If you've got an extended private office, which is 2/3 appointed politically, but not accountable politically, as I understand you, that, to me, slightly kind of muddles it. And I just wonder why you haven't gone and made the complete break and said, actually, incoming ministers need a political team, and then everybody is clear as to what the roles are and what the accountabilities are.
I mean, I understand that. I mean, I think I take issue with a couple of the words you've used. I mean, you talk about the civil service being independent. It isn't meant to be independent. It's meant to be impartial and able to serve equally a government, whatever the government is. But it's not meant to be independent. So I think that's quite important. And I think one of the things that is really important is that people aren't encouraged to believe that being impartial means you're somehow indifferent. And the best civil servants I've had working for me over the years are those who I've kind of strongly suspected, I wouldn't dream of asking them, strongly suspected might not vote for my party, but whose commitment to getting done what my agenda is has been absolutely unquestioned. So I think impartial does not mean indifferent, and the best civil servants invest a huge amount of passion in what they do. But then the question about having a wholly political ministerial office. See, when I talk about ministers being able to make the appointment personally, that doesn't mean it's a political appointment. I mean, ministers do actually choose their private secretaries. That doesn't make it a political appointment. And most of what you want done in your office as a minister isn't political. In fact, most of what special advisors do is not political, actually. There's this kind of idea that all that special advisors do is add a sort of party political gloss. Actually, they spend their time doing a vast range of other stuff. And the thing that they have that is absolutely clear is that they are accountable only to the minister. And what you want as a minister is not the sense that everything is overlaid with politics, because actually most of what you do in government isn't political, actually. Particularly what I do is mostly not political. And what you want is people who get what you're about, who understand it, who can help you drive it through. And I think a lot of what ministers will want to get by way of potentially people coming in from outside are not people who are going to... There may be people who will do policy, people with specialist policy expertise, and there's a very valuable function, and particularly as we move more towards the kind of open policy making that Jeremy Hayward is a great advocate of, is outsiders who can kind of challenge the advice you get from an expert perspective from civil servants, to challenge that monopoly that I think everyone agrees is not perfect. But actually what you're going to want is people who are progress chasers, I mean, who are concerned with implementation. Are things happening? You know? And so I think it's wrong to think that what ministers crave is lots more political advisors.
Bob,
No, I think Francis will answer you. Right?
Come forward.
Yeah, Comment with University of Manchester. I'm old enough to have been around in the early 1990s and spent most of the time studying the disintegration, decentralisation, diversification, disaggregation, which was the policy of the major government and was going to lead to a more efficient and effective civil service, in particular breaking up personnel systems, breaking up IT systems, breaking up purchasing, and so on and so forth. We now seem to be reversing nearly all of that, and I'm just wondering how it comes about that both of those sets of reforms lead to a more efficient and effective civil service. But I would say, just as a note as well, thank you very much, because it keeps us academics gainfully employed studying these things.
Yeah, I suppose the answer, I mean, civil service is no different from other big organisations, big complex organisations, a multinational company, for example, or a conglomerate. There are times when you draw more control to the centre, there are times when you loosen it, and no one would ever say there's a perfect answer which is the same for all time. In IT, for example, there are different needs at different times, different possibilities at different times. I think, and you learn from what's been done in the past, and sometimes painfully and expensively. And I don't think there's anyone who would now say the right way to do IT is to have every department taking wholly independent decisions about their IT, which mean that interoperability, connectivity is limited, and it just doesn't make sense. So you kind of try and get things right according to how you see it at the time. But with a much smaller civil service, which we already have and are going to have even smaller, the idea that you can, you would want to have, let alone can afford to have, all of these functions run completely separately would just not stand examination. And the work that's been done shows really clearly that our current model of functional leadership is, compared with other OECD countries, is relatively very, very weak indeed, and that there are big benefits to be had from strengthening it.
Rob?
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to have seen the same phenomenon in local government, actually. And when I came into Sheffield, the view was that in order to get empowered teams, you had to let them run everything themselves. So we had 5 payroll systems, and it was inefficient, poor quality, very uneven quality, and didn't actually deliver empowered managers in the first place. So I think, if you ask my kind of view about the cycle, we started with very centralised systems. People reacted against those poorly run centralised systems and thought the answer was to devolve everything. And we've now seen, I think, a move back to, a more sensible balance where we try and run corporate systems, shared systems that people can and do use effectively, but do achieve the economies of scale and consistency of standard. I think actually technology has made that more possible, and in fact more essential. So if you take digital as a thing, if you're producing a website, you can either get everybody to create their own website, which is expensive and inefficient, but it's almost the same amount of resource and time needed to create one decent one as it is to create 200. Do you know what I mean? Each one costs the same amount. So I think technology has also made it possible now to have effective procurement systems, effective IT systems, and so on, that are more corporate. And we're moving that way on legal, we're moving that way on purchasing, we're moving that way on internal audit and so on. And I think it's the way in which we're going to be able to sustain a model in the future of individual departments, but efficiencies of scale and consistency of leadership. That's my view. So I think actually both of the previous extremes were wrong, really.
Right, Robin Butler. There's a mic coming for you, Robin.
Robin Butler, former head of the Civil Service. I was very glad to hear Francis describing the Civil Service as impartial but not independent, because I think one of the damaging things that can happen is if it becomes a sort of us and them, civil service on one side and politicos on the other. But what therefore did rather surprise me is here Bob referred to this as a joint report. A joint report between the government and the civil service as if they were separate things. Surely this is a government document and it's described as civil service, but I take it this is a government document. I think it's really very important that one emphasises that the government and the civil service are part of a joint team that work, and the civil service work full-heartedly for the government.
I mean, I suppose, I'll have a go at that. I think it's, and your fundamental point is, of course, completely right, Robin. But given the desire of some in the media to present this as kind of conflict between ministers and mandarins, is the kind of shorthand, I think we thought it was really important to emphasise that this is not kind of being imposed by ministers on the civil service. This is very much kind of a lot of the ideas in all of this, going right back last year, have come themselves from the civil service, and it's not, so it isn't kind of one side imposing on another. I think that was the point.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, you're right that this is a government report. But the constant, you either get you get one or other story running. The first one is that ministers are being led by the nose by the civil servants, and it's our agenda for change. And I think you've got a bit of that, Francis, on the first report. Or alternately, it's ministers imposing their change on the civil service. And I think I wanted to get across really strongly that this is a shared agenda, that this is as much in the interests of the civil service as it is for government and for ministers. And that's really what I meant by, perhaps joint was the wrong word there, a shared agenda is what I perhaps should have said.
Could I just come in on that? Because in a sense, thinking one of the big initiatives when you were head of the Civil Service and Cabinet Secretary, next steps and so on, that ministers were involved, but it was very much being driven by you and the senior civil servants working for you, wasn't it, Robin?
Well, I mean, the civil service had to implement it, but it derived from a report by Robin Ibbs, the next steps, which the government endorsed and directed us to execute. I was wholly in favour of it, but in a sense that was irrelevant, because, you know, I mean, even if I hadn't been, it would have been my duty to carry it out.
I just wonder where the balance comes. I mean, you know, with a particularly activist minister like Francis, and which is not the tradition, and therefore, in a sense, underlining the points of both Francis and Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you very much, Bernard Jenkins, Chairman of PASC. Thank you, Minister, for the early sight of your statement. I think the discussion about the narrative is an interesting one, because any corporate change, any change program in a very large organisation is an extraordinarily difficult thing to achieve. And actually, your point 18, changing the culture and behaviours, is actually the most important thing to change. And it's the most difficult thing to change, and it becomes the most difficult thing to change when people's first reaction to change is resistance, which is a very natural human reaction, and therefore I fully endorse this joint approach. But what are we learning from previous failed attempts to reform the civil service, and from this only partly successful so far attempt to change the civil service? Because you finish up at the end of your score sheet, I mean, improving culture and behaviour only gets an orange, and I wonder whether that's even a bit optimistic in terms of what's actually changed. And then you talk about we want to go further by developing a longer-term vision for reform civil service, including changes to organisational structures and ways of working. In any corporate change programme, that is the bit you would start with.
Yeah.
And you would then have a different narrative to sell to the workforce, to explain to the workforce and to bring them on board with, rather than this granular approach. I mean, Francis, I really admire the way you get your hands dirty in some of this detail, in the way that so many ministers shy away from, and what's happening on procurement. The Major Projects Authority, there's some real successes, and the savings you've made through the Efficiency Reform Group. And you can change culture by bringing in outsiders, but the history of our civil service is the outsiders are still called outsiders, even if they've been working in the civil service for ages, and eventually they're spat out and forgotten. And what they changed reverts to type. Incredibly resilient system, this. Where we took evidence from Jonathan Powell, amongst many others in our evidence, and he says the thing he most regrets is not coming in with a plan at the outset. That incremental change was the wrong way to go about it, and he now regrets that they didn't have an overarching plan, which is why we keep coming back to this question of how you generate consensus around such a plan, which may indeed be much more radical than what you have on the table at the moment, because of all the things that have changed over the last 30 years.
Well, I mean, what do you learn from not all previous reforms have failed. I mean, the one that Peter mentioned, that Robin oversaw, the Next Steps agencies, was a success, and it was very well executed. The big lesson is you have to stay on the case. You know, you do not just publish a report and hope it'll turn into something. But it was kind of noticeable that Tony Blair made a big speech about civil service reform, including announcements in 2004, and some of it just kind of disappeared. But it's not enough just to announce it. You have to stay on the case. And I think your point about culture is absolutely right. And I think one of the things we all a bit regret about last year's plan is that, kind of almost as an afterthought, we had Action 18 at the end about, oh, by the way, we'll change the culture. And I think one of the things, particularly our non-executive outsiders have said, is that that's the big overarching thing, and it's not a separate thing. Actually, all the other things should contribute towards the culture change. And while I think the status we attach to progress reflects the fact that we haven't really developed a sort of single plan on how to change the culture, there already is some culture change which simply arises from things being different. You know, the movement towards more integrated common services starts to change the culture. It starts to break down the silo culture, making it easier for people to move between departments through common standards of promotion. That helps. Having a fast stream, putting in place a fast stream which is run genuinely as a corporate resource where people who come into the fast stream are moved around as you would do in any other graduate training scheme, starts to build that a different and a much more common culture. So I think one of the things if we were starting again, we would do is do that part of it differently. And I mean, I do. You know, my kind of mantra on this is you don't change the culture by trying to change the culture. The culture changes because behaviours change, because there are different patterns established, different demands, and people respond in different ways. And the biggest change in culture, I think, is needed is the civil service is still a very hierarchical organisation, which is not really mostly about its structure and its organisation. It's much more about behaviours. And that's because in too much of the civil service, people aren't given a sufficient clarity about what they're expected to deliver by way of outputs and outcomes. And so the space within which they have freedom to do their job because they know what's expected of them isn't sufficiently clear. There's too much ambiguity, which means things are slower, people aren't required to take responsibility to the same extent, and the counterpart of that, they don't have as much freedom to innovate and do things differently and thus get more satisfaction. I mean, jobs are satisfying when you have a lot of scope to make decisions that make things work better and deliver what's expected of you, and you're taking responsibility for it. And I think this still quite hierarchical culture militates against that, and that's, I think, the biggest thing. It's a massively difficult thing to do, but it's really important.
Bob? Well, I share everything that Vance has said. I think just 2 points to add then, so as to give time for others. One is that I think we're now clear, and we were clear when we kicked off with the plan. There were some very high level and important actions that we needed to move forward. That's why we went with the approach we did. We're now clear that if we want to move on to the next stage, we must have a stronger vision about the civil service 5-10 years' time, and that's why we've recast the action in there. And actually, I think the second point I make is, whilst each individual action in the plan might look incremental, you take the combined effect, and it's pretty substantial, the change that we're undertaking now.
But the vision isn't particularly clear, though. So the vision in 5-10 years' time.
Well, that's what we're saying, in effect. Yeah. That's an area we want to work on.
No, exactly. That's exactly the point I'm making. The clarification of that, particularly given the spending challenges, isn't yet clear.
Well, I'm not sure that that's right, actually. I mean, I think, you know, the way we described it a year ago kind of feels like it was right then and it's right now. And what did we say? It'll be smaller, it'll be flatter, it'll be faster, and those two things are very related. It'll be more digital, more unified, and with some of the stuff we're doing today is absolutely about being more unified. It'll be to have better performance management, and Bob's talked about that, and we've made progress on that. It'll be focused on outcomes, not process, and be kind of less bureaucratic in that sense. Have modern terms and conditions. And it'll be more fun to work for because people will have more chance to be satisfied because they have more freedom to innovate and get stuff done. So kind of, I mean, when I talk to large groups of civil servants, which I do, and I describe, you know, what the civil service could be like if we did all of this, I absolutely see people kind of nodding and responding, and it is what particularly sort of civil servants in the middle and junior more junior levels, it's kind of the civil service they want to be part of.
Right, time for a couple more questions. Pauline. You.
There's some very interesting proposals there. I'd like to probe one or two of you, don't mind. But Francis, I would hope that you're in the game of reforming government and not just the civil service. And I would like to see that as the headline, really. Ministers have an awful lot to do to increase corporateness in government, I can tell you, as ex-civil servant and ex-minister. The thing I wanted to probe, if you don't mind, is the relationship and the likely effect of increasing the Secretary of State's private office. As far as I can see, it's a Secretary of State. It makes me wonder about the role of junior ministers, whether in fact all of them will be justified in future, because I think there will inevitably yet further centralisation of policy in the Secretary of State's office as a result of the increased influence, frankly, in private office numbers. But the effect of increasing the weight round the minister on whatever basis, and frankly it does sound like a cabinet to me, and I worked in a cabinet system, and cabinets are mixed cultures. I've never known one that didn't have people from the department in it. But, and putting the permanent secretary on a short-term contract. What is the perceived virtue and advantage of doing this? I mean, Bob might be interested in what he thinks about that, but I don't entirely understand what the merit of that is.
Well, which bit?
And what is it of the short-term contract? Why no presumption of continuation? What's the merit of putting somebody in that position on a fixed term and fairly short-term basis? And is not the total effect of these reforms to shift power a bit towards ministers?
Yes,
to me,
absolutely.
Yes. So
it's kind of the way it's meant to be, isn't it?
Object in mind. What is the outcome that you're seeking?
But I mean, you put your finger on it. Yes, it is to give ministers more power to get stuff done, because ministers are accountable. Ministers are elected. They are the democratically elected government. They stand or fall by what gets done.
How are you going to measure your increased performance?
Well, we get measured by the electorate every 5 years. That's, I tell you, well, you've been a minister, it feels very, very accountable. You feel very accountable on the Today programme, you feel very accountable when you stand up in the House of Commons, you feel very accountable when I make one of my regular, indeed frequent visits to Berners Committee. You are very accountable. And every 5 years you have to stand for election.
How are you better supported by a permanent secretary on the short-term program?
Well, first of all, the biggest extra support to a minister is in the extended office, which is personally appointed and personally accountable to the minister. So that's point one. Point two is not particularly about increase. The permanent secretaries being on fixed tenure. It's not about giving more power to ministers. It is about increasing accountability of permanent secretaries. No one that I have heard of has made an argument against it, because I don't think there's any other system, comparable system, where the most senior officials are appointed. I mean, ours will still be actually a relatively softer system than other countries, because Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it's a fixed contract. Your life as a civil servant comes to an end if it's not renewed. That's not what we're suggesting here. It's simply fixed tenure in the post. And it kind of feels like that's the way it ought to be. I mean, it's what Tony Blair proposed. It's what happens everywhere else. What are the reasons against it? If everyone else...
No, hold on, Pauline, hold on. I just want to give two very, very brief questions. Bob, do you want to quickly comment?
Well, very quickly. I mean, I think, first of all, let's be clear, these are people who will be on standard contracts for doing a particular job for a period of time. And actually, I think that holds no issues for me as a period of 5 years doing a particular perm sec role. I do think it sharpens the expectations from the permanent secretary. It won't be and shouldn't be aligned with electoral cycles.
No.
It should be about as and when you take on the role. So actually I don't think there's a huge issue that emerges from this in those terms. And it's pretty consistent practice actually in most organisations I've worked for. And actually the median tenure of permanent secretaries here and now is 3.7 years. So you know, 5 years would actually be longer than many have stayed in the role in recent times. So I think just keep it in perspective is all I'd say.
Now we've got time for only six-word sentence, Josh.
I'll take a few more. Existing perm secs, are they going to have to renegotiate their contracts?
Okay,
So they're on fixed
okay,
terms?
that one, and there's one there.
Right,
Yeah. So 6 words only.
You've got jobs to go.
Which 6 would you like? Just this? A very mundane point, as you point out, Peter, the scope for muddle, bickering, confused accountability with a set of extended ministerial offices is potentially very great if it's mishandled. Is there going to be some kind of a model developed that we'll be able to comment on?
Yeah. Well, just on that, I mean,
Fine, thanks.
the confused accountability, no, it'll be much simpler because the office will be appointed by the minister and accountable to the minister. At the moment, there's confused accountability. Are you accountable to the minister or are you accountable to the permanent secretary?
Right, on
So
the
this is much
renegotiation
simpler.
point.
On contracts, no, it won't. Those who are on existing contracts stay on those contracts. This only applies to new permanent secretaries and to permanent secretaries who get promoted to a bigger job.
But they'll have the
very
opportunity to move on to a fixed tenure if they want to.
Yeah, but it's
Be
not.
ungenerous to
It's
deny
not
them that.
required, and
Yeah.
we won't be forcibly renegotiating people's contracts.
Well, could I thank you, because I see your private office, Francis, are eager to
frantic.
waft you on to another
My
meeting.
non-extended office, yeah.
Your extended office. Could I thank you, Francis, could I thank you, Bob, for your candour and responding and explaining the plan. It's been very helpful to launch the debate, and lots of things which will carry on. We'll be carrying on Institute for Government. I see my colleagues around the room nodding, looking perplexed, so a lot of work for us, and we look forward to seeing you back at regular intervals for that. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the events, another team of the IFG for hastily organising this event, which they've done with their usual splendid smoothness. So could you join me in thanking Francis Bob Kerslake?